que já não estava. Estou? Ok. Obrigado. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here. It's been a while. So Pedro already mentioned the title. This is joint work with Han Wang, who is a PhD student at Monash, which hopefully will finish sometime end of next year, and with my colleague Russell Smythe. I should say as a disclaimer that I arrived here on Sunday night. So for me, this is like 2 a.m. So if everything goes wrong, I blame it on jet lag and not the fact that I'm presenting this for the first time. Okay, so let's move on with the motivation of this paper. The motivation of this paper is this recent literature that kind of suggests that the reason why humans are so successful as a species comes from our ability to work with non-kin. Okay, so the ability to cooperate with people with who we are unrelated is unique among species and allows us to be pretty much everywhere in the planet with the level of life that we currently have, and succeeds over many of the other species. This ability to cooperate is sustained by norms that typically tend to privilege our capacity to work with people who look like us, and maybe as a result, try not to work with people who are different from us in some kind of, in some characteristic, okay? In the paper, we mentioned some of the examples that come both from the development and both human development and economic development literatures. Most of the conflicts among primates, for example, are across intergroup lines, not within groups. Similarly, civil wars are mostly fought along ethnic lines. I'm sure you all saw those pics about a white child sitting with a black child, and everyone is happy and cooperating, and then the whole thing is that racism has to be taught because when they are young children, they live so happily together, right? That is not true. Even young children have already the bias against those who are different, but not necessarily in terms of color, but in terms of people who speak differently from their mothers, because implicitly they recognize that they are different from their own group. And this is true in terms of 1-year-old children. And I believe that most of us, if not all of us, know Schelling's work on how even mild preferences for not being a minority can lead to completely segregated neighborhoods, okay? And if you haven't played with that kind of animation online, it is a very instructive thing to do. If you work on social networks literature, you will know that most social networks are characterized by homophilia, right? Typically, people tend to connect as part of their social networks and gain access to resources through them by linking with people who look like them. Okay, so those are examples that come in different literatures. And what we're going to look here is one aspect of this relation, which is prejudice, okay, which has been defined as a negative bias towards a person based on what we perceive about them rather than our direct knowledge about them, okay? It has been one of the most studied behaviors in social sciences. There are 2 relatively recent literature reviews on extensive work that has been done to try to reduce prejudice. Is everything okay? Thank you. And despite all of this importance, at the same time, we know very little about why people exhibit different degrees of prejudice and why some people are more prejudiced than others, okay? And that could potentially matter if we believe that understanding the origins of a behavior which should help us design better policies towards changing that same behavior. So that's what we try to do here by analyzing the historical roots of prejudice and trying to link this with the importance of pre-modern agricultural technology, in this case, paddy rice cultivation. So this is really linked with a large literature that tries to relate several norms of behavior, economic preferences, and so on, with the agricultural origins of a lot of our economic activity. Okay, so maybe the most well-known paper in this literature is Galore and Ozak that try to show how time preferences are related with the prevalence of different crops or the suitability for different crops across the globe. Among this type, or along this line of work, the one that is closest to what we've done here, and in fact, shares for the most part a lot of similarities with what we've done here, is work by Thomas Tomhelm and some of his colleagues in what they call somewhat pompously the rice theory, okay? Which is essentially a series of analyses of collectivism versus individualism behavior using lab experiments in China, and showing that essentially university students in some of the top universities in Beijing behave very differently depending on whether they come from regions where rice is the main crop, traditionally the main crop, versus areas where wheat is the main staple historically. Okay. A growing literature has expanded this type of analysis to look at a variety of behaviors. Okay, Hang in the economic, Hang and Martson in a recent paper, the European Economic Review, if I'm not mistaken, tried to explain the prevalence of democratic norms precisely on the basis of the importance of rice or not. Several other psychologists and sociologists have looked at the tightness of norms and behavior associated with the perception that norms should be obeyed or not. Again, linking it with the prevalence of this concept. So there is I'll talk a little bit in a bit about what makes Paddy different. But before, I want to address the question of whether we are being prejudicious towards China by focusing on China. And the main point is, this is an empirical paper, and the main reason why we're going to focus so much on China is that there is a huge amount of very good quality data for this country. China is also historically a relatively homogeneous, politically constant country, ethnically fairly homogeneous. And that creates a relatively stable environment in terms of intergenerational transmission of norms. And because we want to link contemporaneous behavior with past history of agricultural practices, we want to make sure that neither the technology nor the patterns of agricultural production nor the variables that we are ultimately going to use to achieve identification have changed through time. And all of that is true in the case of China. Okay? At the same time, I also want to emphasize that this is not just the China story. Okay, this is going to be, the patterns that we're going to show here are very much true for at least 12 other Asian societies. I think there is a little bit of an emphasis in economics to pay a lot of attention to what happens in some forsaken city in middle of Missouri and not pay a lot of attention to what happens in many other places in the world. If you take these 12 societies together, we're talking about half of the world population. Okay, so there are 12 countries out of 170, but we're talking really about 50% of the population, okay? Okay, so what makes Paddy so special? I want to argue that there are essentially different technological characteristics. The first one is Paddy is very highly productive, both in terms of kilograms and in terms of calorie. Paddy produces pretty much almost 3 times more than wheat, which is the other next major staple in China, okay? Why does this matter? We're going to argue that this matters because high productivity led to tradable, marketable surplus, okay? The most well-developed markets in many, now I already know how to do this. Most earlier markets are in fact grain markets, and that is also the case for China, okay? So one of the things that we want to explore is this relation between the idea that high yields create markets, and markets have this really interesting similarity with what is the main approach in psychology about how to reduce prejudice, which is called the contact theory, okay? This idea that routine, purposeful, non-status guided interactions between different people leads to a reduction in prejudice. If you read to the type of relations that Allport had in mind when he suggested the contact hypothesis as a way to reduce prejudice as pleasant and cooperative contact between locals and outsiders engaged in the pursuit of mutually beneficial transactions. This is not very different from how we would characterize market transactions, right? Okay. So there is, curiously enough, for those of you who may have came across the work of Albert Hirschman, a very old literature among classical economists that talks about the civilizing effect of markets, okay? In the name of his somewhat famous book, his point is that the interests that come from trade overrule or tame the passions of identity that promote conflict, okay? Yes, please.
Can you just explain a bit better the hypothesis, just in terms of like this cooperation slash competitiveness in a market? Just because basically you're saying that people, if I understand well, you're saying that if in the market people tend to cooperate, but what about competition? And so they are competing with each other.
I'm not really saying that. I'll come to local cooperation in a bit.
Let's go to your point, which is there is this paper by Matlow in the AER, the cricket paper. And basically what you find using the contact hypothesis is that it matters if people are competing or cooperating with each other in a setting. So basically found that in the cricket league, if they were competing with the other guys, they would maybe their prejudice would increase against the guys from the other castes. So I don't know, I was just a little bit puzzled about the hypothesis.
Okay, so the hypothesis is the sorry?
Your hypothesis, not the contact hypothesis.
Okay. Mostly trade brings into contact different people, right? Because most profitable trade takes into account or benefits from different opportunities from trade, which necessarily require you to be in different environments, right? Okay, so what you're suggesting here is that is precisely what is bringing also into contact people from the south with people from the north that typically would not have to contact with each other, okay? And transactions in the market are essentially meeting this type of requirements in that both of you, if you're trading with me, both of us will only engage with each other if we are really going to benefit from each other, right? The idea being that if we don't know each other and if we speak different dialects or whatever, right? The market creates an opportunity for me to get to know you, get to trust you, eventually repeat this type of transactions and so on, okay? Allport's suggestion is that the repetition of this type of contacts through time lowers prejudice towards others, okay? I might not like your dialect, but after successfully trading grain with you, I kind of understand that you're a trustable person.
But that also depends on complementarity or substitution of the individuals in the market, right? That also goes from that idea that I think it's a paper of something that one with traders in the Indian Ocean, that it mattered if
they talked about
complementing if the Hindus and the Muslims were complementing each other, or
yeah,
if they were.
We're not going to have such detailed data on the identities of who is trading. We're only going to have data on which regions are mostly integrated or not, okay? So which ones are going to be part of the grain market trade or which ones are less connected to it, okay? And we're going to use that to essentially test the importance of this mechanism versus the alternative one, which is the one that has received most attention in this literature, which is Paddy is different because of two other productive characteristics. One, it needs permanently flooding, okay? And permanently flooding and controlling of the water table requires the provision of local public goods. Those work better if people share the norms that allow common property resources to be managed, okay? So that's one avenue. The other one is that the amount of labor that is needed to both plant, transplant, and harvest rice is much greater than what is happening with other crops, particularly wheat. How is this work? How are these labor requirements met? Essentially through labor exchanges, not through labor markets, okay? Where do labor exchanges happen? Happen within families or related people living in a local environment that is, and they are maintained again by the same type of norms of knowledge within the us group that potentially creates a distinction with those who are outsiders. So the second hypothesis then is that this aspect of paddy production that requires a high level of cooperation is potentially going to increase the salience of the divisions between us and them, okay? Meaning that the idea that, the groups that are underlying so the suggestions of social identity theory suggested a long time ago that the simple definition of in-groups and out-groups is enough to foster the idea that those who are not with us are different and worse than those who are with us, okay? That also means that if you put the two together, the overall effect of whether paddy leads to a reduction or an increase in prejudice is essentially going to be an empirical question that is going to depend on the relative strength of these two mechanisms, okay? Yeah.
This second hypothesis is good. To an extent, it depends on who is us and who is them, right? Because the simple fact that you interact more social is to put with you in the direction of reducing prejudice, right? Just that, just simple fact that I'm not alone anymore, that I do more work with other people, I need more provision. So just that simple interaction, social interaction, would be different from that sense to be on the other direction. I mean, I understand your direction.
Sure.
It relies a lot on them and what we do.
Okay. Okay. I was asked to kind of repeat the question, summarize. Sorry, I didn't do that with yours. I forgot. So, which also allows me to repeat the question and try to make sure that I'm answering it. So Pedro's question was about whether social context within groups wouldn't in itself also reduce prejudice similarly, because you would think of yourself as being part of a group. If social identity theory that says as soon as you are part of a group, you see those who are outside of a group as worse than you, then the answer would be no. Because the people with who you're cooperating on at least throughout the production cycle, are your group, right? Those who are outside. Sorry?
So your answer is it's related to your measurement of pressure.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let me move on then. What is the, yeah.
What is the geographical version of this production? Is this a regional thing, so like the north produces paddy rice, but the south does? Does everybody produce paddy rice? And if so, there is no it's just competition, right? There's no trade. What is the
But I'll get back there in 2 slides, okay? All right, so where does the data come from? It essentially comes from something called the World Value Survey, and we're going to use data from China and 12 other Asian societies. we're essentially going to relate prejudice with the importance of rice controlling for individual and for either country or province characteristics. How is prejudice going to be defined here? So the World Values Survey has this very interesting set of questions that are asked all over the world, which are essentially asking who is it that you don't want as neighbors, okay? And it gives you a series of characteristics, some of which are related with behaviors, drug addicts, adulterers, alcoholics, stuff like that, and some of it which are related with personal characteristics, but not behaviors. Immigrants, foreign workers, homosexuals, people of a different race, people of a different religion, people who speak a different language or dialect, okay? So our measure of prejudice is simply going to be the sum of how many groups are there that you do not want as your neighbor, okay? Based simply not on their behavior, not on anything you know about them, other than each of those 5 characteristics, okay? The interesting thing here, or one of the interesting things about the pattern of these answers that we don't spend a lot of time discussing in the paper is how highly correlated they are, okay? Essentially, the best predictor of whether you do not want someone from a different, you do not want immigrants as your neighbors are whether you don't want someone from a different race or from a different religion, okay? And this may seem somewhat obvious, but a lot of the economic literature is about people's dislike about racism separate from prejudice towards immigrants, separate from religious intolerance, okay? So and that also means that if you do a simple multiple correspondence analysis, the first component of that analysis pretty much where each of these measures enters with an equal weight explains almost 97% of the variability in the pattern of these answers, okay? So my take on this is maybe there aren't people who are racist or people who are religiously intolerant. Maybe they are just people who are general bigots and they don't like people who look different, regardless of whether it's the dimension, okay? Which I think is something that goes a little bit unnoticed in the economics literature. How is going to be, the importance of paddy is going to be measured essentially as the importance of paddy rice farming as a percentage of total farming area. And in China, and in most cases, we are going to use relatively recent measures of the importance of this variable. I'm going to argue that if we want to look much more back into history, we're going to find exactly the same results. Simply the sample starts to get smaller. Okay.
What's the key subscription?
Province. I is individual. But China will have 29 provinces. Tibet, and Xinjiang are not served.
But you got more than China, right? Like you got 12 countries.
Yeah, but I'm mostly going to focus on China for a variety of reasons, including the fact that when I want to discuss mechanisms, I only have data for China. Okay, and a lot of the more detailed data that we have is in fact data for China. Cool.
Prejudice. So I'm not really an expert on this type of data, but to which extent do you think that this kind of survey data will be measuring your propensity to say that you don't want these kind of neighbors, but you are really missing those people that like it but don't say it? So are there like behavioral measures, for example, of prejudice that will behave differently from this? Or do you think this is a good measure? So how much do we know about that? Because this will relate to your question. We are going to try to measure the impact of this historical practice on your measure of prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly are we measuring? What are we missing?
So Katya's question is whether we should believe in this or not, or there are any kind of other lab experiments.
Don't you often detect?
As far as I know, there are not. You also don't have any kind of contrasting between survey questions and more typically variables like or ways of measuring prejudice like implicit association bias tests or stuff like that. So we are in the process of trying to complement or trying to collect our own data on prejudice in China, where we are going to relate behavioral measures in terms of incentivized games, in particular the joy of destruction, with their pattern of answer to the same kind of questions. So maybe my next visit, I'll be able to, either me or Anne will be able to answer the question. But at this stage, it is what we have, okay? All right, so we obviously know that there will be a lot of, I mean, running that regression there as an OLS is never going to achieve identification. How it be achieved that we're going to do it using an index that has been constructed by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is the environmental suitability for growing paddy. And what is this? Is essentially an index that brings together how suitable an area is given its climatic and soil conditions to grow this crop. But importantly, has nothing to do with whether paddy is in fact grown or not. Okay, cool.
What's the argument for using such a coarse measure of variation in paddy rice propensity? Is it just that well-value survey doesn't tell you where people are more granularly than their products?
Yeah. And outside of China and India, you only get really the country, you don't get the regions. Okay.
Oh, so you don't even have products?
Nope.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Okay. Can I go on? Yep. All right. So first, the question of is 1996 historical enough? Obviously not, but at the same time, if you relate the importance of rice in the mid-90s, 1990s, with historical evidence of the oldest archaeological relic for this crop for 19 provinces, which is as much as you have, this is a simple correlation between them, 0.8. Okay? If you look at what is happening between when you're trying to correlate the area of rice that we're going to use in the 29 provinces with paddy at the beginning of the 20th century, I mean, this is almost a perfect correlation between them, right? This brings to what a lot of people have noticed in this literature, which is the pattern of agricultural or the agricultural production pattern in China has been remarkably stable over the centuries. Okay. All right. Going back to your question. Yeah, Alex.
So how does this graph relate to your ID, for example? So there is the correlation between ID and when the instrument and measure is higher for 1996 or for earlier?
I really don't remember. When we do, well, we're going to get exactly the same results when we use instrumental variables, but we use this as the treatment variables. Okay, so it won't really make any difference whatsoever. Okay, so I don't really remember the values of the univariate correlation, but they all pass the IV tests, and they are strong enough to allow us to identify an effect. And the effect that you estimate is essentially, if anything, is slightly larger than when you look at the data from 1996. Okay. Okay, so what does paddy production look in China? Southern crop with this slight extension. What you have along here is the Yangtze River. Up north of the Yangtze River, you have mostly wheat producing rice. South, you have mostly production rice, okay? Darker is greater importance. How does prejudice look like? Darker colors is a larger number of groups that you do not want as neighbors, okay? Less rice, more prejudice, okay? That's essentially Everything that we're going to do here is put this in numbers, but that's the story. Okay, yep.
Can you, I don't know if this happened allows, but do we potentially south of the river? Because I don't know, I've seen so many papers on India using this river to show everything possible. And it looks like it's going to be your main source of treatment heterogeneity. So I don't know if you could make just a little robustness exercise to check what's happening if you drop the north and just use the variability that you have south of the river, because you seem to have some variability.
We do, in effect, for reasons that I'm going to show you maybe 10 slides from now, a lot of the analysis of the mechanisms are in fact going to be focused here, because this is the most densely populated area of China. It's also the kind of the core of the empire, the king during Qing dynasty. So that's also where you have the data on the mechanisms, and the whole thing holds. Okay, yes.
Maybe this will be the next slide, but are you also going to present one for the environmental stability?
No, I don't, because there are too many.
It would be interesting just to also to understand how is the variability across provinces in China.
In terms of what you have in the paper, and I think that's what you have here, is that again, the relation between environmental suitability and where rice is produced, again, the univariate correlation is almost 0.9, okay? Which brings back us to the story of why this happens, essentially because rice is so much more profitable than any other kind of crop. So wherever it can be grown, it is grown. Cool? All right. What do this look like depending on once we just run this regression? First on, yeah, Alex.
Just a clarification. Here, the percentage is the overall share of land or
Farmland.
Farmland.
Yeah.
So are the one Paddy are comparable in terms of prevalence of agriculture versus non-agriculture? So is rice localized in areas with highest prevalence of agriculture versus forest?
I don't know, but in any case, we end up controlling for the percentage of cultivated land and the percentage of irrigated land to kind of get rid of that, and the effect doesn't change. So, okay. All right, so the first column is essentially just running an OLS regression of the number of groups that you don't want as neighbors on the importance of paddy on the province that you currently live, or the lagged importance as in 1996. There are different standard errors here to deal with different problems of how to address correlation between units. They really don't change anything, so I'll skip that part. The second column, we control for as many covariates as we can, taking into account that we do have only 29 provinces. These are mostly covariates at province level, but they are typically the set of variables that previous literature has emphasized or has suggested that are related with prejudice. Exposure to warfare and rebellion, for example, just a minute. The importance of disease prevalence and so on, which has been used as one of the explanations for why people dislike others, as in people who come from abroad are typically sick, so you don't want to deal with them and so on. Yes, go.
Okay. So maybe I should have asked this before, but when we were discussing the data of 1,000 survey, but are these from different waves? This is all.
I'm only using the last wave from China. Okay. Thank you. All right. So what you have at the end is essentially the IV estimates that we have. Again, they pass the tests that you want to do in terms of identification and strength of the instruments that you may want to carry about or worry about. The effect that you have is essentially negative and tells you that when the importance of rice goes up by 1%, that leads to a reduction of 0.01 in the number of groups that you want as neighbors. Okay. Again, this is the story that you have here. Okay. Less rice, more precious. Cool. So as I said, this is just putting numbers into what that map is telling us. Yeah, go for it.
I know you're going to show us mechanisms, and the mechanisms have to focus on China because of the data. But like, can you make that picture for India too?
Sorry?
The picture you just showed us.
Yeah.
Can you make it for India?
Can I make what?
India.
Yeah, I will.
Right?
I will. And I love the India picture. And I'll get there maybe in 4 slides or 5, unless you really want to see it now. I'll show it now. Okay, so this is the India picture. Why do I really like the India picture? Because one of the obsessions is that this is a north-south thing, right? There's some God-forsaken mechanism or omitted variable that is different between the south and the north. That fabulous mechanism in India operates east to west, right? Because that's what you have here, right? That's why I love this map. So if you have something that in China works south to north, and in just around the corner in India works east to west, I'll be very happy to hear about it, and we'll try to measure it and control for it. But that's what you get from this map in India, not much more. Okay? So let me go back to one of the favorite things that we always like to do, but I'm not going to show numbers, which is robustness checks. Okay? Does this change if instead of looking at composite measures of prejudice, we just look at what is happening at each individual prejudice? No, it doesn't. Does this change when you start controlling for geographical characteristics or other variables that may impact, for example, on contact between people like soil terrain ruggedness? It doesn't. Does this change if you look at lagged economic conditions as far back as the 15th century? It does not. Okay. Does this change when you exclude some of the provinces where rice has a much more recent history? It does not. In fact, it strengthens our results. Okay. Does this change when instead of looking at the entire population, you only look at urban residents, most likely never grew any kind of agricultural crop? It does not, again, suggesting that what matters is you're being exposed to a cultural context that is shaped by the past agricultural practices, not you being a farmer yourself, okay? And one of the important things about, and an advantage also of using the China data is in China, because of the restrictions to mobility, the only people who are interviewed in the World Value Survey are people who live in the same area where they were born. So we know that they are, in fact, if there is a kind of a cultural explanation for this, this is in fact related with the fact that they have lived there, okay? Okay. South-north issues besides the map of India, which I think kind of dispels that. We can use the fact that there is a sharp difference between the south and the north of the Yangtze River, and we limit the analysis to those 10 provinces. This is essentially what you show. Again, there is no change in the result. Okay? So essentially, we are going to get whatever way you kind of slice this sample and additional variables that you may want to consider, given the data limitations and so on, you're always going to get the same result. More rice leads to less prejudice. Cool? All right. How specifically Chinese are these results? Not much, okay? So you see pretty much the same in India. Here, instead of north-south, Paddy is west-east crop. Again, less prejudice in the west than in the east. Cool? Yeah.
By the first step is if there is when there is production of fatty rice, there is no need to trade, right? So the hypothesis is that trade leads to less prejudice. Then there would be
where there is production, there is less. Well, why would there be less need? Well, there's less need, but there is certainly more opportunity to trade because you have a market or surplus. Okay, let me get to that in 3 or 4 slides where I talked a little bit about market integration and how we measure exposure to market. Okay, can I go on? Yeah.
Is Paddy also as prevalent in India as it is in China?
Sorry?
Is Paddy also as prevalent in India as it is?
In terms of importance, no, but what we're measuring here is not rice, it's paddy in both cases. Okay. Again, what do you have? A relation between the environmental suitability index, which is we'll keep using as an IV, and the importance of rice in 2008. We no longer have historical data for the importance of paddy for India. Again, univariate correlation of 0.767 for the 17 provinces. Once you do the same analysis, what you get is a slightly lower estimate of the effect of the crop on prejudice, but still negative and still precisely significant, precisely estimated. How does this look when you move from China or India to look at the 12 Asian countries that we, for which we have data that are part of the World Value Survey? Exactly the same thing. Okay, where paddy is less important, prejudice is higher. Cool? Yep. And again, the relation between environmental paddy suitability index for the same period and the importance of rice for the time that we have data is pretty strong. The effect, if anything, when you look at what is happening in these societies, excluding China already, is, if anything, more important than in China itself. Cool. So paddy matters to reduce this kind of behavior. We can do this with some more certainty in China than in other countries, but the relation exists in all these countries for which we have data and in which historically rice has been an important crop. Okay. All right. So far, I don't think what we are doing is very much like a lot of the other analysis that you have on this type of literature, on this type of rice theory literature, with a different dependent variable. I think what we add here mostly is why is this the, yeah, Alex.
Let me just ask, so if you replace prejudice with education, you get exactly the same results? Or so this is
I haven't tried.
Prejudice, or
sorry?
About education?
Well, we control for education in individual controls, so I don't think it is.
That's it.
Okay. As I was telling Wayne, educated people think education solves all the problems, but that's not the case here, necessarily. Okay. What may explain this reduction in prejudice? We're going to use essentially mediation analysis with instrumental variables to try to disentangle the effect of market integration and the importance of social identity at the local level that sustains local cooperation between the two of them. Okay, so what is mediation? Essentially, we're going to use data on the instruments as coming from measurements of market integration and the strength of clan in the Qing dynasty. So as a treatment, we are going to naturally use measures of treatment that are before the 15th century, okay? And the only one that we have available is the oldest rice relic at province level, cool? Which we have shown before is very much related with the current import or 1990s importance of this crop and so on, cool? All right, the mediators are essentially going to be the proxies for market exposure and strength of local cooperation. We're going to use as an IV the same that we had before, which is the environmental suitability for paddy. What is we're going to have is present the relation between the treatment and the mediator, estimate the relation between the mediator and the current importance of prejudice, and the mediator effect is essentially the product of these two. Just a minute. Is of these two coefficients once you control for any other type of mechanisms that may drive these results. As with any kind of mediation analysis, while we can argue that the IV creates exogenous variability in the treatment itself. It's harder for you to argue that the second step in this path is exogenous, unless you also control for anything that may be simultaneously correlated with the mediator and the outcome. And so we are going to include here an additional set of mechanisms that have to, of controls that have to do with proximity to the coastal area or the river, anything that essentially is going to facilitate trade by itself, regardless of the importance of grain market integration. You had a question, sir.
I'm wondering if there's historical data on markets development. Because the way I was understanding your hypothesis is that the standardized is gonna create early market, then I was expecting a heterogeneous analysis, which maybe comes with a bit less hypothesis, does not allow to show exactly the same thing. Because historical market is one thing that should be related to the development of prejudice, right? And today's market can be related to many of them.
Sorry, can you say again?
There can have been like an accumulated history of the place that makes that today's market are what they are, which has a loose correlation to what was the market development historically.
Sure.
So it was your story.
My story is that living in an area where rice is historically important, okay? In this case, measured by the oldest date that you can be precise about where did rice start in that province, okay? Is going to matter in many different channels. One of which is going to be markets, okay? Which we have information not on current markets, but on markets 600 years ago, 300 years ago.
So this mediator is the one 600 years.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Which I thought was what you're saying, but I wasn't sure. That's why I wasn't sure whether I was understanding your question. Okay. All right. Markets, the first, how are we going to measure the importance of markets? I'm essentially going to use time series data that already that has been used by Ellen Xu and her co-authors to analyze the functioning of grain markets in China and comparatively the financial development between China and Europe, which is Paddy time series data collected twice per year in a core of 10 provinces in China by the imperial government, essentially to monitor the functioning of markets and whether food aid was needed or market interventions were needed and so on, okay? So we have this data, and what we're going to do is essentially try, and this is where those of you who may love time series will probably understand what's going on. I'm not one of them, but essentially what you're doing here is looking at the coevolution of prices between a pair of markets and try to understand whether they can move through time so closely that the two markets have to be linked, okay? Beyond some level of statistical significance. That's essentially what this is doing. So we have data for 121 prefectural provinces, prefectural markets in 10 provinces. That means that you can have 9,395 pairs of markets you're going to perform this test, and you're going to find which markets are integrated or with which market, okay? And then you're going to aggregate this at the province level and figure out how many markets in this province are going to be integrated versus the other ones, and use the variability that you have in that part of China as an explanation for that. So not sure if you can see that very well, but essentially here, darker colors mean markets in that prefecture are going to be more integrated than those where the colors are lighter. Yeah.
Trying to look back a bit to the questions that we had at the beginning, does that mean that you can overlay where is a market with what is the suitability of that place and see if you have basically markets that have different places that have different suitabilities, so these places are complements?
I'm really not sure if you can get, you probably can get Paddy suitability at prefecture level. I haven't looked at, but what would you get out of it? Yes, that's why I'm saying it probably can. But what would you get out of it?
Be able to overlay the market data and say if these markets are competitors or are complements. If they end up trading, so you have an integration.
But I only have grain prices.
Yes, but if the places produce different things, like one place produces paddy, the other not. Because on average, the province is good for paddy, but this village is very good for paddy, and the other village is very good for wheat. And we trade, we have integrated markets. So where's the complement? That would not be. And this data should allow you to do that.
Probably does. We still need to aggregate at province level, though, when we're trying to then relate this with the outcome, because that's as low as you can go when you're trying to do that. So although this looks,
it's even more interesting. I'm very excited about this question because then you can test if that is the same sort of hypothesis as in the Maslow paper of saying whether you have a Prejudice effect by determination, depending on the fact that the markets are suitable or complementary. So it's okay even if it's at the aggregated at the
yeah, let me think about it. Here, I'm going to start blaming jet lag with the fact that I'm not totally seeing how I do it. But anyway, yeah, thank you. All right, so how do we measure the strength of social group identification at local level, which supposedly supports a local cooperation? Again, by publicly available data from the similar period on the strength of clans. Okay. What is a clan? If you see a lot of Netflix Chinese movies, is a group of people who are related, who share a common male ancestor, and they are historically recognized as being central to how a lot of the local rules on which paddy production also relies were essentially enforced. And one way of proxying for the importance of a clan is how many genealogies do you have in that location, taking into account the population of each province, okay? The idea being that a large number of genealogies means that there are more people from your own clan with who you're related with and with who you interact with, okay? Okay, what is the problem of doing all this is essentially that although the data on clans is relatively wide, the data on market is limited to these 10 provinces. When you overlap the data on rice Sphaerolicus, it is even smaller when you're only looking at 7 provinces, okay? Should we worry too much about it? When we look at the average effect of the importance of rice relics for the 19 provinces overall, and when we look at the 7 provinces that we're going to pay attention to kind of quantify the mechanisms, we get essentially the same result in terms of average treatment effect. So maybe these provinces on which the imperial government of China decided to collect data are not random at all. Certainly they are not, right? But we have no reason to think that they are substantially different in terms of what we want to worry about, okay? All right. And these are the initial controls that we're going to include to kind of take account or take care of the sequential ignorability assumption. Okay, so how does this look like? The first stage is the relation between the mediator and the treatment variable instrumented by the IV, by paddy suitability, both satisfactory. The oldest places where rice has been grown leads both to a greater market integration and to greater, to more or to stronger clans. How does each of these mediators relate with prejudice? Controlling for the indirect effect of the instrumented treatment variable. Essentially, when the mediator is greater market integration reduces the importance of prejudice. When the mediator is local cooperation as proxied by clan strength, it increases local prejudice. I think the really cool thing here is also that rice relics, which in each of these equations is picking up the alternative mechanisms, have the opposite results when you're looking at in the diagonal. That is, when you're looking at what is happening to clan strength, the alternative mechanisms have a negative effect. What is in these alternative mechanisms? Market integration is one of them, right? Similarly, when you're looking at the effect of market integration on prejudice, what the direct effect or residual effect is picking up is everything else, including clan, the effect is positive, okay? What is the average causal mediator effect? Markets reduce prejudice, local cooperation increases. Okay? The sum of the two leads to an average treatment effect that is negative, as we saw before. So what are the main conclusions of this? And I'm getting close. It's quite strange. I'm getting close to time. Markets are great. That's it. Right? In more ways than we usually typically think of it. Okay? Yeah. Nah. I only pretend to be one to pick up my paycheck. Markets are great to promote the allocation of resources. Hirschman and classical economists seem to be right that markets also civilize people. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you for your questions and mostly for those suggestions that I'll keep thinking about. Thank you.
So let's see if there is any remaining question. Okay, so thank you so much, Paulo.
Thank you, Pedro.